thank you all again for joining us. This is the first Climate Live K12 session of our academic year. This is a video session brought to you by the Columbia Climate School for students, educators, and the public. My name is Laurel Zaimashihi, and I'm the Assistant Director of K12 and Continuing Education at the Columbia Climate School. I'll be facilitating today's session. So for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the Climate School or are joining us for the first time, the Columbia Climate School was founded in July 2020, and it's Columbia University's first new school in 25 years. We're dedicated to advancing transdisciplinary climate research and education and impact locally and across the globe. We are as a hub for innovative climate solutions. The Climate School brings together experts from across fields to address the most pressing climate challenges of our time. The Columbia Climate School is committed to shaping future leaders to drive climate solutions forward in every sector by offering educational programs for degree-seeking students, high school students, teachers, professional learners, and the public. By equipping changemakers with knowledge and skills, the Climate School empowers essential stakeholders in the fight for a just and prosperous society on a healthy planet. So what we're hoping to do today with these Climate Lab K12 sessions is to introduce you all to the work that's being done by our scientific experts. These are monthly sessions that run throughout the academic year, as I mentioned, from November through, this is our second session. We started in October this year. So from October to June, each month we focus on a different topic and it is directed toward a certain age range. All of these sessions are recorded. So if you missed our October session, feel free to look on our Climate School YouTube under the playlist Climate Live, and you will find not just the one from October, but all the past Climate Live sessions as well. And if you would like more information on our upcoming sessions, I will put that link in the chat. As I mentioned, the chat is disabled for you all as participants, but there is a Q&A box and we would love to hear questions or comments from you. So feel free to populate at any point during the presentation and we'll be sure to make time at the end to answer it. So for today's session, When Collective Action Works, Revisiting the Montreal Protocol, we are joined by Ben Baraga from the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, as he recalls a time when international coalition building brought the world back from the brink of a global climate disaster, and how their success bodes well for our newest bout with global warming. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Ben. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Laurel, and thank you to everyone joining us, whether that's live or after the fact. Welcome to this presentation, and thank you so much for having me. So today, well, first of all, my name's Ben. I work at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. I'm a program associate there. We are an applied research center affiliated with the Climate School. And what we do is convene perspectives from all over the place, governments, businesses, nonprofits, and bring them into dialogue to solve problems relating to sustainable development. Today, we're going to be talking about perhaps one of the most famous instances of successful climate collective action, which is the Montreal Protocol. And I'm going to hope that you guys see my slides, and I'm going to just get started. So collective action really starts, and at its core is relatability. We all have touch points that link us to a cause and make us care, even when it's something so abstract as climate change that perhaps doesn't, sorry, I was just checking the chat to make sure. So climate change may not so visibly impact our daily lives, although it does, but it's hard to focus on, day after day. Touch points are what allow us to relate to big picture issues such as these. And collective action is built on finding these touch points and building a platform upon them. So to introduce you a little bit to me as well as the concept, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience with coming to climate change and climate activism. So I'm hoping you can see my little cursor. This is me and my dad, and I think my dad's here. So surprise, you're part of the presentation. When I was younger, I grew up in Los Angeles, go Dodgers. I played a lot of sports, and I played Little League, soccer, football. My dad was my coach throughout all of it, and Something that was very visible to me growing up is that he always carried around an inhaler. Of course, he has asthma. Um, and if that didn't slow him down or anything. He's very active and was able to do everything that he needed to be my coach. But it's something that you realize, my dad had a respiratory illness due to the place he grew up in, Los Angeles, having such a difficult smog problem. And the fact that he grew up not too far away from where I did, and I personally didn't have asthma, neither did my sister. It's not something that's hereditary, it's something that had a real cause and effect on his health. And nowadays, since the smog has cleared up, it was very visible to me that climate action and regulations were what caused me to have a safer upbringing. So my experience allows me to better understand parallel stories across the world relating to environmental impacts. And often people need these relatable pathways to jumpstart their passion for a cause. So allow me to go on that bit of a tangent. I'd love to hear later on what your touch point is. What made you click on this webinar? Take time out of your day at 4 p.m. or even like the middle of a work day to join and learn about climate action. We can't talk about it right now, but I'd love to hear in the future. And these questions matter, getting into our guiding questions when we're talking about policy change, because when you think about how do you get a whole country to care about climate change? How do you get a government to care enough to pass a law? Or better yet, or maybe more difficult, to collaborate with other foreign governments to on this issue. Maybe most difficult is getting a business to care, about an issue that may not align with their top priority, making a profit, or maybe they're being told that this is actively going to go against their financial interests. So, yeah, when we're talking about groups of people, these become very difficult, and they're the questions that the architects of the Montreal Protocol had to solve. And so today we're going to be looking at some of the ways they were able to build a movement in spite of that and find those touch points to get everyone on the same page. So without any further ado, picture you wake up one morning and you see in the newspaper there's a hole in the sky, essentially. I think we have a lot of younger people. I saw some middle schoolers signed up and maybe high schoolers. First of all, thank you for joining. It's great to have you here. But yeah, maybe just to give some context on the fact that the Earth has been facing pretty scary times. There's at least a precedent for it. Obviously, right now is pretty bad. But just to give some context, I obviously wasn't born at this point, so it's just something that we really need to look back in and ground ourselves in. And to give a little bit more context, if you aren't fully aware of the ozone layer, very simply, very basically, it's our protective shield against the sun's rays. It stops us from getting high amounts of skin cancer, really bad sunburns, blindness. Um, and unchecked, the sun rays can also disrupt photosynthesis, decrease our food supply. So this is a very important thing for us and our survival here on Earth. And back in the 80s, we produced a lot of what are called CFCs, which break down ozone. And you can see in this little doodle that they were pretty widespread in our life. The most famous example probably is in hairspray, but really any aerosol can, fire extinguishers, real essentials like air conditioning and refrigerators, as well as styrofoam, they all degraded into CFCs, which were then harmful to the ozone layer. And so this is very pervasive, and it makes general people going about their daily lives, it makes it hard for them to picture what a phase out would even look like. And even more so than on the individual lens, getting three very different types of groups of people on the same page about this issue to reach global climate change is very difficult. So today I'm going to walk you through three very distinct groups and the touch points that eventually helped them come around to the idea of passing the Montreal Protocol. We're mostly taking a US focus just because this was of course, in the 80s, a very influential player in the United Nations, but also because they were the major culprit of CFC emissions. The largest CFC company was called DuPont, and they were based in the US. And the US government had a lot of vested interest in the success of DuPont. So we're going to walk through each one of these and talk about their touch points to the cause. The first one being the public in the US. And I think we often think that the public is automatically going to be on board with environmental issues. Maybe not so much these days, but in your head, it makes sense, right? We see that CFCs are harmful, but you have to consider how diverse in interests the public is. Imagine you're living in a hot area and you rely on air conditioning. You don't want to see your air conditioner prices increase due to a stoppage on one of their major components, right? So people need to be convinced. I'm presenting two major touch points that allowed them to all sort of get on the same page and organize. The first one being momentum. Fun fact is that Earth Day actually started in 1970. So nearly 15 years prior to the events of the Montreal Protocol. And this kicked off what historians call the environmental decade in the United States. So this was a period of great change and great awareness of environmental issues. We passed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, as well as other policy successes. And you can see people are starting to think about their place and their impact on the world, and it's pervading popular culture. And they're seeing that their actions can actually have an impact on the state of our climate. So this primes everyone for the catalyst, which is really just imminent danger. We see NASA publishing a very visible and easy to understand scientific report on the issue. There's a clear hole developing over the years over Antarctica. And then it starts spreading to places that are more populated. This is an article from Newsweek at this very southern tip of Chile in South America, where the dermatologist here is reporting it's as if Martians had landed. People were so burnt on their skin that it was just an unprecedented time in human history. And so imagine reading this in the paper. It really did galvanize the public to call for boycott and call for an end to CFCs and really signaled to both businesses and the government that they were on board with this. Now, speaking of businesses, we have to talk about DuPont. Obviously, they're starting from an even farther reference point away from getting on board with a protocol that would stop a big part arm of their business. But eventually they do actually swing to that side, and there's three touch points here that allow them to relate more with a cause. The first one relates back to this past slide, the fear of future regulation. They had just watched an entire decade of the American public being not only upset with polluters, but being successful in their movements. Something that happened was in 1978, there was a very small policy passed that banned CFCs in those hairsprays we were talking about, aerosols. And it didn't necessarily imply anything about a full global phase out, but it starts to get these CFC producers a little bit nervous. On top of that, they actually are very much included in scientific conversations. They were one of their board of directors was added to an ozone trends panel where scientists explained to them the unavoidable harm that CFC was presenting to the ozone layer. And they start to see the writing on the wall. They're like, okay, you know what? This is something we should probably invest in looking for alternatives. They're not fully convinced. They're still saying these alternatives would be way too expensive. They'd never be viable. But once they start being approached by the government in negotiations, they start to realize something else about this situation. They might actually be able to, if they, as the leading company and producer of CFCs, if they were able to switch to those alternatives first, and if there's a certainty that eventually this transition would take place, then they could actually dominate the market completely as the only player that is getting involved first. So that's pretty enticing. And then that also incentivizes them, interestingly enough, to then act on and support an international ban on the CFCs. They're still nervous that people aren't going to pay more for alternatives. So they're like, let's just wipe out the rest of the CFC market. They have international competition, notably in the European Union and in Japan. And so they break from the industrial lobby and start cooperating with the US government as well as the United Nations to phase out CFCs. And this supports the demand for their higher priced alternatives. So that's a pretty shocking example, but inspiring one in this private sector company supporting the transition and its own phase out to unlock then further potential for earnings. And so I'm not going to spend much time on the touch points of the government because we've pretty much explained it. They know that their constituents have this prolonged and sustained want for environmental issues to be addressed. And now they have this outcry that they know they have to respond to. They also know that they have intertwined interests with one of their large companies that's providing American jobs and tax revenue. Um, and even though DuPont's not begging for a regulation, they've already signaled that, hey, we're taking this seriously, we're investing in alternatives, and the government sees an opportunity to advance this policy that they see as best in the long run. Another fun fact just to point out, and just to again reference this idea of an emotional touch point, is that Ronald Reagan, who is historically known to be very anti-regulation, very pro-free market, um, ends up having surgery for skin cancer on the year that the protocol passes. And obviously, this is a protocol to prevent skin cancer. So this is very relatable. It's a very relatable cause for him. And I'm not saying that disaster has to happen in order to move the needle, but it shows you the mechanisms at play here where people need and groups of people need an avenue to make this ring a bell in their mind and say, you know what, I think I can put my weight behind this. And so now we have a map, right? We have a map that connects each group to the idea of climate policy changes. On the left, we have a population that cares way more about their immediate safety than any other short-term issues. On the right, we have a business that can now envision a future in which they won't go out of business and they're being included in talks, supportive talks by scientists and their government to make sure that this transition is going to go through. And so finally, they break from the industry lobby and start cooperating with the US government and the United Nations to then guide this policy to fruition. So I've been holding you in a bit of suspense. These are the main facts of the protocol. It's a very complex protocol, but this is really what you need to know. CFCs end up being phased out, or the plan is to phase them out by 1996 for developed countries. Um, Developing countries have a little bit of extra time just because they're not the main culprits of this and they may not have the means to do such a speedy transition. Um, so they receive extra time 2010 until 2010, and they receive extra funding. Countries like the US put in money um, to a fund to support technology transfer to facilitate this transition. And this money will then be drawn upon for later iterations of this protocol, which then switch their focus to greenhouse gas emissions. But before we get into that, just to quickly step back and generalize, how do we generalize this story to other issues? I made a little Venn diagram here. I realize they're not circles. They are triangles, but I kind of like the triangle model because you sort of see these visible peaks here where at first glance, and I think especially today, we see the private sector, the public sector, and the general public being very distinct and having distinct wants. But as we start to inquire deeper about their interests, we start to find overlaps. Businesses and government both have an interest in their companies' sustaining their revenue. Obviously, the public and the government want decreased pollution for their communities. And we even have, you know, very small overlaps where everyone agrees. Everyone, the public wants a stable workforce. Businesses want a stable workforce to power their own operations. And so that's what collective action, policy change, it's about taking these hidden shared interests and bringing them to the surface. And on that subject of what's visible and what's hidden, I think we talk about the Montreal Protocol, if you had heard about it before. We think of it as this miraculous last second, maybe will never happen again type of policy. But what I'm trying to stress here is that these movements take time and they're built upon years and years of little small successes in action being taken into account. So we have that sort of environmental decade leading to the aerosol ban, which flips the switch a little bit in DuPont's leadership to start innovating. And then when it's time to react to the whole, people are prepared. It didn't just come out of thin air. And if we go a little bit deeper, see, this is kind of like an iceberg. And now we're even deeper underwater. Um, a lot of us are young here, or we work with young people. And I think it's important to highlight that this all doesn't come out of the blue. It's not just like something that appears on the UN's desk or even on a national level. Local action definitely has avenues to be charted to national attention. I decided to show a little bit of a story from smog being noticed in the early 1900s to this is just one of the grassroots movements. It's actually mothers concerned with smog in LA that ends up leading to the nation's first state vehicle uh, emission standards. And then one of those moms actually ends up being on a board of interdisciplinary um, activists that then advise the first national standards. And as before you know it, we have the Clean Air Act, and then we're starting from this whole story. So it's all linked, and it starts from local action. And as we close down, just sort of emphasizing that the Montreal Protocol is then another step on the path towards um, our future policy action. Just to highlight a little bit of optimism, because this is an exercise in optimism to consider collective action as this big tapestry of events we're building towards the next sweeping change. We have the Kigali Amendment in 2016, as I mentioned, that now targets global warming potential instead of ozone depletion potential. We see that in 2009, we were on track for 6 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100. Then it was 4 in 2015. Now we're at 2.5. Still not enough, but there's been a drop. And just as DuPont had started innovating alternatives to be more and more viable, we know that renewable energy is already cost competitive with fossil fuels. So we start to see sort of parallel trends here. And all that to say, hope is not lost. And as we conclude, I just want to emphasize that these touch points, these shared interests are what policy change and sweeping policy change is built upon, relating these groups to the larger cause that they are focusing on. I wanted to highlight the shared interests between companies and governments because often they're seen as competing, but this is a great example of confiding in their shared interests and how negotiations can bring them both towards a common goal. And then also emphasizing once again that global warming has similar avenues for shared understanding. If anything, the Montreal Protocol itself is a cultural touch point. We start to realize that it's not so much of a leap to go from if we all convened for um, decreasing ozone depletion, we just can remanufacture this policy and now it's focusing on decreasing global warming. And by the way, that fund that was $160 million in 1987 is now at nearly 4 billion for technology transfer to support that transition. So once again, just wanted to point that out and to again emphasize that our capacity is more than meets the eye in terms of our shared interests that can be brought to the surface. And with all that said, um, I'm going to thank everyone for my time. I know this was a little bit long, but um, please ask any questions you have. I want to bring up that question once again. What's your touch point? Why did you click on this webinar? Because these conversations and finding shared interests is what action is built upon, and finding these things we have in common starts to tease out those common interests in a way that's accessible. So thank you for having me. Thank you, Laurel. And yeah, that's all.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was amazing. I certainly have a whole lot of questions for you, but I do want to open it up to those that are joining us today online. Feel free to put your questions in the Q&A button, and Ben would be happy to answer them. But maybe I'll kick it off with a question that we received before the session started from one of our registrants. The question is, how do HFCs differ from CFCs? And what can we do to replace them with?
That's an excellent question. And for context, when I talked that for half an hour about CFC alternatives. So HFCs are what they originally turned to as an alternative. It completely does not affect the ozone layer, so that's a win. What they found is that they still are nearly, and it varies, but they can be thousands of times as potent in global warming potential as carbon dioxide, one molecule. So that's pretty scary. And they started to realize, hey, we our job's only half finished. Um, and unfortunately, yeah, we've now brought an entirely new issue to our doorstep. And that's what the Kigali Amendment is trying to phase down HFCs. And they're trying to look towards new alternatives. And by the way, connecting this back to CCSI, my research, um, I'm we've just finished co-authoring a report, Laura and I, on HVAC and sustainability practices, where we tell this story a lot more in depth, the post 2016 story, and advise companies on how to, again, best grapple with this option. And companies are thinking about it. So, um, although we didn't do this research directly on the history of the Montreal Protocol, this has been all very top of mind for me over the past year because what you see are companies that want to prepare in the best way possible and are preparing for a decreasing the threat of global warming due to this nearly 30, 40-year-old policy that's ever changing and iterating. And by the way, that has nearly the entire global community behind it. So um, yeah, that's a little bit about that.
Thanks, Ben. I do hear about the Montreal Protocol, how it started, and I love the analogy that you used with the icebergs, that there's a lot of like hidden interest that we have, even though at the surface it seems like we are so far apart. And it does give a lot of hope for what we're currently dealing with the climate crisis. You also mentioned, so something that I found so interesting, that for this issue, that there was $160 million that was supported from developed economies to support developing economies to make this transition, because there's this recognized common good that we needed to preserve, right? The ozone layer is depleting. That has an impact on everyone around the globe. So this is, and likely similar to climate change. I don't know, you can confirm or deny, but I'm sure that they were contributing less towards the issue than maybe developed economy countries. So this kind of story is just reminding me of what we're currently experiencing with climate, that at the last COP 29, there was $300 billion that was committed from developed economies to support countries that are experiencing some of the worst climate impacts, that have contributed the least to climate change. And yet that is not even touching the amount of money that is needed to really both mitigate and make that energy transition, but also to adapt. So I'm wondering, like, from this message that you just shared, like, what are some ways that we can get, developed countries to mobilize and provide more funding to support that transition for other countries?
Yeah, that's absolutely, and it's a tough question. I really wish I had a snappier, a snappy answer. Um, like I presented, because the Montreal Protocol is, of course, um, one of the cleaner examples. I think one of the takeaways that, especially working at CCSI for the past year and a half, has taught me is also not just the question of how can we get more contributions, but also how can we get less undermining of the current progress that developing countries are trying to make. They're seen to um, continually attempt to um, take their reliance off of fossil fuels, and you start to see developed countries to come in and undermine those efforts. And so I think the idea that I always return to is that cooperation is something that catches on. It's something that um, leadership by, let's say, the US, but ideally, I use the US in my example, and it's not like they were doing great things on the international stage back in the 80s, but we can come together around certain issues. And so, um, you know, I think highlighting the options for, especially that's why I hit on the agreements between government, public sector, and private sector. We see that as one of the major rallying points that we can start to get into developed economies' ears and saying, this is going to be what's best in the long run. I mean, that's what our HVAC air conditioning paper is about, is saying we can avoid you so much pain in the long run from doing like the wrong transition, investing so much money into compliance that's going to be outdated just because you didn't want to rethink the uh, the design of your laws, and then also on the private sector, your equipment. And so that's kind of a long answer, a meandering answer, but um, yeah, that's where I'm at for now.
Thank you. No, I really appreciate it. I know it's more of like a pondering question myself because there is probably no answer really. It's very complicated. Um, but thank you. I know we are at our ending point. Thank you so much, Ben. This was a fantastic talk. I am just so grateful that we had the ability to hear from you for this. Oh, I'm sorry. If we can allow, there's one more question from the audience.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So Tamika asks, how can intellectual property be protected while also advancing renewable energy around the world?
I think that's an excellent question. I'm certainly no expert in intellectual property. I can speak to the fact, once again, grounding in my experience with this HVAC work. One of the leading air conditioning companies actually did open up their copyright on one of the sustainable refrigerants that has lower global warming potential, with the expressed purpose of making it open access for developing countries to and companies in developing countries and economies to um, start using this and integrating it into their equipment. So in some ways, it's about I don't know. I don't want to consider like too many of the implications, but if the leading companies are doing it and are taking the stigma off of being so protective of intellectual property and realizing that a lot more good can come of this. I mean, when you look at the story of DuPont, they also make this decision because they want credit for the transition. They want the public to see them as someone who is striving towards a brighter future, and they get a lot of it. They get a lot of praise for cooperating and collaborating with Montreal Protocol. And seeing those types of gains and weighing them as heavily as maybe some of the strictly profit related gains in the short term, shifting that vantage point and that worldview is super helpful in my opinion. But again, I'm not an intellectual property expert, just something I was thinking about.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, that they all of a sudden went from being the main producer and maybe like the bad guy to flipping the script and being perceived as, solving the problem is really interesting. Um, well, thank you again, Ben. If you have any questions for Ben, I'm sure he'd be open to answering them offline. And if you are interested in joining us next month, the session is going to be on a student's perspective on sustainability inside college life. So we're going to be joined by undergraduate students at Columbia College that are sharing about their experiences navigating majors in sustainability and what that might look like for you if you are interested in pursuing that pathway as well. Ben, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Laurel, and thank you, everyone. Please feel free to reach out. These conversations are super important. So thanks for having me.